Harwich. A historic harbour. Heritage. Houses. I mean, these go back to 1724. But then we come to the Electric Palace. A palace in Harwich, electric. People were shocked. I'm not surprised. The Electric Palace? I mean, it sounds like a Moody Blues album. The Electric Palace, let's face it, was a wonderful name. Who'd got behind this as an idea? I mean, was it the council or the mayor?
It was the brainchild of Charles Thurston, who was a travelling showman in East Anglia, and he used to take his film shows round village greens.
What, in a tent?
Bioscopes in tents, and set them up on village greens. And when he saw that this site was available, and he knew the way things were going with purpose-built cinemas, he thought, that's it, that's the ideal place to put a cinema. So he commissioned the architect, and they built this very quickly. I think it was a matter of 18 weeks.
Michael, presumably the architect who took on the job had pretty much a blank sheet. I mean, who was he?
The architect was an interesting man. He was a man called Harold Hooper, a young man, 26 years old, and this was his big commission, which made him. But you can see from the architecture that here was a man who had absorbed completely Thurston's wish for a cinema which would attract the public.
Of course, this was the earliest days of cinema building, so I suppose a place like this was sort of state-of-the-art at the time because, well, there hadn't been anything like it before.
This building is exuberant. If you look at one of the original drawings which he did, it's very impressive to see the vigorous style of architecture. And on it, Hooper has drawn a young man with a swagger cane, with a trilby hat and a pipe and an air of tremendous joie de vivre. And I think that was Hooper drawing himself.
But it does have a sort of pre-electric, pre-gas sort of look, doesn't it? You know, I mean, you have to face it, it's got like the British Empire written up here. I mean, there's room for a coat of arms up there. I mean, is it that sort of 19th century style that's still hanging on?
The auditorium has that Victorian opulence, the Frank Matcham Victorian opulence. But Hooper, somehow or other, produced a building with its showman's baroque front elevation and its delightful plasterwork inside the auditorium, which was a true cinema. And if you look at this elevation on the outside, which once upon a time had a small column at the top of the building, and also had pendant electric lamps outside, which was great fun, must have been great fun.
So electric lamps?
Oh yes, there was a gas engine in the basement which drove a generator, and on a Saturday night sometimes the gas pressure was a bit low, and so the gas engine would miss a few beats and the belt would come off and the lights would go out, the projection equipment would go out. There would be a riot as the dissatisfied customers gave vent to their annoyance until the engineer could climb down into the basement and restart this gas engine.
So when did the cinema first close then? 1950 something, was it?
It first closed in 1956, and the reasons for that were that there'd been the East Coast floods in 1953, and this auditorium where we are now had been under 8 feet of seawater, which didn't do the seats a lot of good. Then in the mid-50s there were quite heavy levies, entertainment taxes on cinemas, and it also coincided with the advent of television.
So it was closed here, just a relic for all that time. Why didn't somebody knock it down and develop something as they did with so many others?
At that time, in the late 50s and 60s, Harwich as a town was run down, and it was just ignored. It was allowed to just stand here.
Ironically, I suppose you could say that the floods stopped this being a cinema, but in a way saved it and preserved it.
In a way, yes.
How do you come into the world of cinema? Are you a film buff?
I moved to Harwich in 1973, and on my sort of induction tour around the town, somebody pointed out this building and said, "There it is, that's the oldest cinema in the universe," and it's falling down. And this sort of struck a chord, and I thought, well, why is nobody doing anything about it? And things sort of went from there.
But what was it like when you first opened it up again? It must have been like, I don't know, Tutankhamun's tomb.
It's absolutely dreadful. You opened the door and you actually had to stand back, and you were hit by this stench of all the rotting floorboards and rotting seats and dead cats and bits of old prams.
Not dead usherettes, I suppose.
No. And of course, when we went into the projection room, this was like going into an Aladdin's cave. In there were the old projectors still there. Some of them still had pieces of film in them. Obviously, when it had closed, it had just closed. One Saturday night, they said, "That's it, close it up, lock the door," and off they went.
How long did it take you to get, all the seats or some seats back in and the lights and everything? So it was a potentially working cinema.
About 6 years.
Did it?
Yeah.
So you've got all these mouldings and so on picked out in very clean, bright colours, but, I mean, is this how it was originally? I mean, how could you know that?
One of the fascinating things about restoring the auditorium was the plasterwork. And what we did was we dismantled the best of these panels, which is quite a step to take, made templates and mouldings from them, and then recreated the damaged ones in the original material, which was horsehair and plaster. So there's no fiberglass. It's all done in the original material, and it is really impossible to tell which is which now.
So you have recreated it as
Yeah.
near as you
As near as we
sensibly
could,
can
yeah.
to as it was.
That's right.
Chris, as I walked in, I noticed, I don't know if it's a bit of licence on your part, but over the door, one door says admission 1 shilling and the other says admission 6pence.
The reason for that is that when we scraped the paint off the doorways, we could make out very faintly the lettering, and that was quite exciting actually. As you scraped it, you went along scraping it off, and it became apparent it said admission 6pence.
By definition, I assume that the shilling seats must have been the best seats, but were the best seats down the front or up at the back?
There were 3 prices in those days. At the back were the very best seats, which had antimacassars on them. Those were the shillings. Then in the vast body of the building were the middle seats, which were 6pence. And then at the front there were wooden benches, and this was the twopenny rush, and they really crammed them in there. The seating capacity of this cinema in 1911 was 370, and it's now 200. So you can imagine how they crammed them in at the front.
Now, Colin, perhaps I'm being a bit naive, but my view of a cinema is a building with a manager or owner. He pays the staff, and the people, they come in off the streets and buy tickets and come in. It's not quite like that here, though, is it?
This cinema works almost entirely with volunteers, about 25 volunteers, managers, helpers, projectionists, sweet sellers, that sort of person. It wouldn't work on a full commercial basis. The town is probably too small.
Yes, but you can say, oh, I've got volunteer projectionists, volunteer usherettes and all that sort of thing. But can you have a volunteer audience? I mean, do the people of Harwich queue up and want to come into this cinema?
It operates as a club cinema with membership, and we have something in the region nearly 8,000 members, which is a very high proportion of the town, and most of them are Harwich people, and they support it very well. Many people wait until a film comes here because we're a little bit behind London and Colchester, for instance. Some come and see it again if they've seen it somewhere else. It doesn't make a profit. It's not intended to make a profit. If there is a surplus, it's paid over to the trust, and then they plough that money back into restoring the building and repairing and so on.
So are you saying then that you're optimistic about the future of this cinema?
I think this cinema has a future. I mean, it's one of the oldest operating cinemas in the country. It hasn't been altered very much. It has, of course, moved on, as in my view, rightly it should. For instance, we've got better heating, we've got better ventilation, we've got better sound systems than we had in 1911. But then in 1911 they had the very best, and that's what we're trying to do now.
I think it will stay as an example of how cinema used to be. But at the same time, we want to move with the times, because I'm sure that Charles Thurston, the first showman, if he realised that you could beam in programmes from satellite, and have a digital picture, he'd be the first one queuing up to get it in this building.
The Electric Palace has been here right through the 20th century, and it'll go on right through the 21st. It'll be here long after I've gone, and you. And when people are watching their cyber cinema, there'll still be plenty of pals for the palace.